So good afternoon. This is the ad hoc transition committee meeting, special roundtable discussion of the Committee on Police Practices. Today's date is Thursday, March the 11th. Our topic of our roundtable today is independent investigations. Let me call roll of our committee members, and I'll just recognize the ones that I see available on the Zoom here. I'm Doug Case. I am the first vice chair of the CRB and the chair of the Transition Planning Committee. We have Patrick Anderson, who is our Commission Community Outreach chair and a member of the committee. We have Diana Dent, a member of the committee. We have our chair, who's an ex officio member of the committee, and that's Brandon Hilpert. And then we have our liaison with the San Diegans for Justice, who is the Kate Yamati. And I don't see any other members of the committee present, so we'll go ahead and start the roundtable. And I will introduce you, Patrick Anderson, who is our Outreach Community Chair, who will serve as the moderator and host of today's roundtable. So Patrick.
Thank you, Doug. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. So many of you coming back after our 4 roundtable series over the last few months. I just want to say I've really missed you all. It was an intense little 4 roundtable series for that first part of the transition process. But even though it was nice to have a little bit of a break from the planning and the compiling of comments and all that, I found myself missing this particular Zoom meeting, if not other Zoom meetings. So thank you for being here. As you know from the emails, we're proceeding apace with the transition process. And my role, as I've promised to all of you, and I just want to reiterate this, is to ensure that there is ample time for community engagement and that the work of the transition is kept transparent to all of you, to the public, and accountable to the public. So in a moment, Doug is going to give a relatively brief update on where things stand with the transition process. Again, this is a part of making sure that we're being completely open with where we are, what steps are yet to be taken, and also to create opportunities like this one for you all to make your voices heard. I'm very happy that Jason Wechter, who has decades of experience in police oversight, generously agreed to join us today. I'll talk about him again in just a few moments after Doug gives an update. And then we'll spend time together for the second half of the roundtable, or a little more than the second half, answering any questions you have about investigations undertaken by oversight bodies. And also, I'll be recording your ideas, your thoughts on this particular aspect of the City Council's implementation ordinance and the work of the Permanent Commission. All of us who are here today are interim commissioners, sort of caretaker commissioners, whose job it is to ensure that we proceed through the transition process while continuing to provide oversight of the San Diego Police Department. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug to give us all an update on where things stand with the transition to the Permanent Commission. So Doug, take it away.
Okay. I think many people, or maybe people in today's community roundtable, attended one or more previous roundtables. So I'll kind of give you an update of what's happened since the last roundtable, which was at the end of January. After that roundtable, Patrick compiled a very thorough report to summarize the input from the roundtables, as well as some guiding principles for the new commission. And then we were asked to make recommendations to the Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods Committee at the meeting on February the 10th. And at that meeting, We gave our recommendations regarding the implementation ordinance that included such things as how many commissioners they should be, the composition of the commission, the criteria for being on the commission, the tenure, and so forth, as well as some other elements of the implementation ordinance. The action today by the City Council was to refer to the City Attorney the process of drafting the implementation ordinance. Once that ordinance is drafted, and there'll probably be some back and forth between the City Council and the City Attorney's office that'll need to go to a meet and confer with the Peace Officers Association. And then along with the implementation ordinance will be permanent standard operating procedures, which will go into the details of how investigations are run, for example, and how discipline will be recommended, etc. We made two other recommendations which had to be deferred for reasons I'll explain momentarily. The first was to recommend that Charmaine Mosley serve as the interim executive director. The executive director serves at the will and direction of the commission, but the appointment is actually made by the City Council. And we learned that in order to appoint an executive director, we had to have a city department to appoint her to. And creating a city department requires the creation of an ordinance. And it's one of the things that the Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods committee did at their meeting this past Wednesday was to begin the process of creating a office of the Commission on Police Practices. That's important not only so that we can hire the executive director and also hire additional staff, but also so that we will have a budget center so that we can be part of the upcoming budget process. Second, we recommended interim standard operating procedures, which allow us to continue doing our oversight functions, especially as they relate to review of internal affairs investigations. How we are developing the permanent standard operating procedures, and that document recognizes the fact that the commission has the duty and the discretion to conduct investigations, and that document had to go through a meet and confer process, which happened last Friday prior to the City Council's Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods Committee meeting. And so the PSNLN approved the recommendation of hiring Charmaine Mosley as our interim executive director, and approved the interim standard operating procedures. The next step of the process is the budget. We had hoped to be further along by now. The city is facing a budget challenge. That challenge is much less than it was with the passage of the federal COVID relief bill, which provides funds to cities and states, and including an estimated $300 million to the city of San Diego. And so while everything was on hold pending that, we're now ready to move forward. And we actually have a meeting tomorrow to talk about creating two supplemental positions for the current fiscal year. The city's budgeting year or fiscal year starts on July the 1st of each year and goes through June 30th. And so next month, now that we are our own department, we will be having hearings on our own budget. The good thing is that each of the city council members submitted their budget priorities, and all 9 of them included the included full funding for the Commission on Police Practices as one of their top priorities. And we also met with the mayor, and he reiterated that it's also a top priority of his. But it'll still be very important that we have community involvement in the budget process so that we get the full funding that we need. And then in addition, another part of that budget will be getting office space. And so once we pay staff, we'll need a place to put them and have operations. And so we have looked at some a place initially, and we've put a budget request in for office space. And so we're moving along at as expeditiously as possible. And part of the purpose of today's meeting is that the city attorney's office has asked us for guidance on what an investigation process should look like, so that can be included in the implementation ordinance and permanent standard operating procedures. And we wanted to get the advice of experts and get the input from the community. And so that's the purpose of today's meeting. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Patrick.
Thank you, Doug. As always, thorough, helpful, and to the point. So as Doug said, we've been asked by the city attorney to chime in on the question of what an investigation under the new commission should actually entail. And so we wanted to make sure that we share with the community how that question and invite feedback from all of you on what we should then hand off to the city attorney by way of guidance. So I'm thrilled to introduce Jason Wechter, who's, as I said a few moments ago, going to speak to us for about 30 or 40 minutes about his knowledge and his experience. Jason has decades of experience as an investigator and practitioner of civilian oversight. He's a former board member of the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. He's in the Bay Area now, and I believe he's doing some work now for Oakland PD that he may talk about. But he is a true expert. I've heard him speak a few times, and I feel like every time I hear him speak, I learn 27 things I didn't even know I didn't know, in addition to the 100 things that I knew I didn't know that he knows everything about. So I'm thrilled that Jason, again, generously offered to visit us tonight and spend these 2 hours with us. And with that, Jason, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I've had an opportunity to look at the summaries that Patrick did of your previous roundtables, and I would just want to say I'm incredibly impressed with the breadth and depth of how you've approached these issues and looked at them from all sides. And I think what you've done here could be a model of inclusiveness for how a community can shape an oversight entity, bringing together various viewpoints and doing the process slowly and deliberately. So I applaud all of you, because I know you've put in a lot of time and effort to doing this and getting it right. So thank you. I'll just expand a little bit on my background, because what I'm going to say is really a function of my experience. So I've been a licensed private investigator in California for 40 years. And I started my career doing criminal defense work, primarily for indigent defendants. So I was able to see, well, I wouldn't say firsthand, but secondhand issues involving law enforcement and mistakes they made, abuses, and particularly when I interviewed pitches witnesses. And those are witnesses, people who have filed previous complaints against the law enforcement officer. And I would interview them and heard horrible stories. And one thing that always struck me was when I asked them what happened, they say, I don't know, no one ever contacted me. No one really seemed to care. So when there was a ballot initiative in 1982 to establish civilian oversight in San Francisco, I jumped at the chance to work on that campaign. It passed. And the following year, I went to work there as one of the first supervising investigators. I left after a year because, and this is a point I want to make, the communities that worked to establish that then did not remain engaged in ensuring that it succeeded. And there were other forces at work. The police union plays a major role in addressing a police commission and making their concerns and priorities known, and the community was not there. So unfortunately, the mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, opposed the creation of the oversight entity, as did a majority of members of the police commission. So it didn't really have the support it needed. It didn't have the authority or the funding. So I left and went to work for the public defender's office, then was in private practice, and came back to that agency in 1998 when it finally had what I thought was a good director, someone who had a career previously as a civil rights lawyer. So I worked there for 18 and a half years. I spent 3 years doing equal employment opportunity investigations of discrimination and harassment for a public agency in the Bay Area. And now I'm doing work for the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland on a temporary basis. But I want to preface that what I'm saying is my own opinions. They don't represent NACOL or any of the agencies I've been affiliated with. So I'm going to take you through sort of my sense of what an effective and thorough oversight investigation should look like. And it's really going to be up to you to determine which elements of this you want to put in the ordinance and which ones you want to have in standard operating procedure. I can tell you, what I know about other practices. You can certainly look at the ordinances for other agencies around the country. I think I've sent some of them to Patrick. But so I know that the CPP is primarily charged with investigating officer-involved shootings, in custody deaths, and deaths that result from interaction with a police officer. We would hope those would be few and far between. We would hope there would be none. But primarily, I think what it'll be doing is looking at lesser types of complaints, and those will be generated by complainants. So the first element of an investigation is going to be interacting with the complainant and doing the intake interview. And that may be by phone, it may be in person, but the primary focus there needs to be openness to that individual, letting them feel heard. And so many times I felt complainants came to the office where I worked, and just sitting down and letting them talk and listening actively and showing that your concern is really meaningful for them. And maybe the first time someone in a public entity has shown that level of concern. People want to tell their stories. They want to feel heard. So just sitting there, being patient. And I have some notes here I want to consult. You really want to have minimal interruptions. You want to get the complete understanding. It's important for an investigator to acknowledge the limits of their cultural understanding due to different life experiences. The reality is most people who work as investigators for oversight agencies are in middle-class occupations. They probably have something of a middle-class background. That may be dissimilar to some of the people who are bringing complaints. So they need to understand that there are differences there, different experiences, and acknowledge those. And maybe ask for that person's understanding and helping you to understand some things. It's important to give them as much information as possible about the process. That gives them a greater sense of control. Knowledge is power. And then get the full story, find out what happened, what their concerns are. And this should be done by seeking an open-ended narrative. It's often said good investigators listen much less than they talk. That's a key. And getting the who, what, where, when, why, and how. The why is going to be important. To ask someone, why do you think this happened? And they may say it may be because of their race or ethnicity. They may say, well, my brother filed a complaint against this officer or filed a lawsuit against this officer. Maybe that has something to do with it. An investigator wants to find out their perception of why they think this happened. So you want to do the thorough patient interview. You want to ask them who might have information about this. And I think the three most key words for any investigator are who would know. And I get this from Don Ray, who's an investigative journalist. And the who can be a person, it can be a document, it can be a piece of evidence, it can be a video recording, a CCTV camera recording, cell phone video, the officer's body worn camera video. And that's something that's going to allow you to answer a question that you need an answer to, that's going to resolve some issue, that's going to be an important step in the investigation. So you want to ask them who might have witnessed this, who did you talk to about this, who would have knowledge about this. And something I learned doing EEO investigations, where you're often dealing with issues of one-on-one encounters, it might be sexual harassment, contemporaneous statements that a victim makes to other people can be very important in establishing their credibility. So you want to say, when this happened, who did you talk to about it? Did you write it down? Did you go on Facebook? Did you, put it somewhere in social media? Because those consistent accounts, particularly if they're close in time to an incident, can be very valuable. So the investigator wants to get all of that. They want to document any physical evidence they may have. If their property was damaged, you need to photograph that. If a person without shelter calls and says, the police officer destroyed my tent. Well, the investigator really should go out there and document that and photograph that destroyed tent, because that's going to be important evidence. So if they have cell phone videos, you want to download those. If they have injuries or if there's any physical force used, you want to document that with photographs. Want to have them sign a HIPAA medical release, without which you cannot get any medical records. So that I'm just taking through some of the steps in dealing with a complainant. Let them know what's going to happen, in the sense of what the next steps are. And obviously in California, we're somewhat limited by the Police Officers Bill of Rights and the evidence code regarding the information that can be made public. But let them know that early on. Let them know about the fact that there is a public commission that holds public hearings where they can make their thoughts known, where they can be listened to again, and just to kind of explain the entire process to them. Then the investigator wants to look at what's immediately needed evidence, evidence that may lose its value over time. And this would be things like CCTV videos. If it took place on the street, often you can go on Google Street View and see if there are any cameras, but I would frequently go out to the scene and knock on doors and say, tell them where I'm from. Can I get a copy of that video? Could I take a look at that? Those videos may not be retained, may only be retained for a set period of time. And if you wait too long, they may be gone. So that's going to be an important step. The next step is identifying the allegations. If the conduct the complaint describes did happen, what rules or laws would it violate? This would be the San Diego Police Department policies, which are online. And that's going to help focus the investigation. Know what essentially what rules or laws the officer is answerable to. Also want to identify additional allegations that the complaint may not have been aware of. They may be talking about what happened to them, but you're going to be looking at the entire process in the law enforcement agency. So there may be issues of, was reporting done properly? Was the body worn camera turned on when it was supposed to be? Were certain notifications made? Were things, things they may not have any knowledge of? And we encountered that a lot at the agencies I worked at. You also need to, the investigator also needs to be aware of other possible misconduct that may not immediately be connected with the complainant's complaint. Now, where I worked in San Francisco, our policy was if it was misconduct related to that complaint, that was something we could add. But if it was misconduct by another officer and something not immediately related, we would not investigate it, which is something I did not agree with. I believe investigation should be conduct oriented rather than complaint oriented. You're doing these investigations to enable management, and that includes the chief of police and the commission, to effectively manage the department and manage its personnel and take necessary steps to correct inappropriate behavior. And be aware of it, and that may lead to policy changes, changes in training or supervision, as well as remedial action with that particular officer. So for instance, I was investigating a complaint of bias policing, someone who claimed they were stopped because of their race. And in order to see whether this was a pattern, I looked at that officer's other activities during traffic stops. And in some of them, I found behavior that to me seemed to violate department regulations. But because those individuals had not filed complaints, I was not able to investigate that. And I saw that as a failing of that agency and its approach. And again, going back to my EEO experience, when you become aware of any violation of rules, you want to investigate it. You don't want to let that sit. EEO laws very stringent that once management becomes aware of any potential violation, they are legally obligated to take action to address it, to investigate it. I think the same approach should hold in law enforcement oversight investigations. Another key element is creating an investigation plan. This is going to list, and it's going to evolve. It will list the evidence, the documents, the interviews that are going to be needed to resolve the issues and questions that you have. And it's going to change over time. And this is important because it's also a form of quality control. When a supervisor comes in and reviews that, if someone audits that investigation, this enables them to see, did they properly identify the issues, the questions, the necessary evidence, and did they obtain that evidence in a timely and thorough manner? And when outside agencies, when come in and audit an internal affairs or agency or an oversight agency, these are some of the things they look at. Are they essentially achieving the goals they have set? Did they set those goals appropriately? And then it's going to be a matter of going out, gathering documents, gathering evidence. This might involve doing a canvass at the location, knocking on people's doors around the time it took place, seeking witnesses. Identifying witnesses the complainant or other witnesses may know of. And when a complainant is interviewed, you always want to ask them, did anyone see this? Did anyone hear this? Who are they? And you want to take an active approach. You don't want to say, ask them to call me. You want to say, well, who are they? What do you know about them? If you don't know the name, do you know their nickname? Do you know where they tend to be? Who would know them? Who would know where they are? You want to really suck up all that information so you can make a very active and assertive effort to contact those witnesses. And then it's a matter of interviewing witness officers and subject police officers. And here, the same dynamics of interviews apply. Getting an open narrative, using open-ended questions, avoiding leading questions, which I've sometimes seen on the part of internal affairs investigators. Not assuming things, asking the officer to explain jargon, which officers often do as a type of shorthand, things like fighting stance or for officer safety. Getting them to really break those down, to describe it, maybe reenact it in a way. Show me how that individual moved. Show me your physical motions. So you get a very clear sense of what was happening. I am of the belief regarding officers viewing body-worn camera footage. I am of the belief, and a lot of people in oversight support this, that officers should not view their body-worn camera footage before before giving a statement and before before being interviewed. And there's some good reasons for this. One is you want that officer's uncontaminated recollection. You also want them to explain their emotional state at the time. And if they view the video, they may be narrating unconsciously or consciously what they saw in that video, rather than giving you their genuine emotional state, which is very important for evaluating their behavior. Why did you act as you did, particularly with uses of force and deadly force? So my posture would be, you interview the officer very thoroughly, then you show them the body-worn camera footage, and then you give them an opportunity to explain any potential discrepancies, recognizing that human beings are not video cameras. We do not play things back exactly as they happen. There's been a lot of research on recollection and perception, and people make mistakes in perception. They make mistakes in recollection. Doesn't necessarily mean an officer is lying. It may be an honest, function of faulty perception, faulty recollection. And should not feel, you don't want officers to feel that that's going to be held against them. It's going to be an assumption that they're lying. And that's been an objection a lot of police unions have raised, saying if you don't let the officer view the video footage and there's a discrepancy, the perception will be that they're lying, and that should not be there. And they should be reassured regarding that. Open-ended questions, the inverted pyramid format, narrowing the focus, going into greater detail, clarifying things, making sure all ambiguities are resolved, essentially giving them an opportunity to tell their story. Obviously, subject officers are represented by a representative. Sometimes it's an attorney, sometimes it's a fellow police officer. Their general standards on their behavior, that they are there to observe, assist the officer, but not interrupt, not interfere with the investigation. And at the end, I let the officer know, I will give you and your representative as much time as you want to clarify things, to add information, to make any points, to put anything you want on the record, to let them know that door is going to be open. With every interview, it's important to leave the door open for someone to recontact you and for you to recontact them. And at the end of every interview, I ask someone, is there anything I haven't asked you that I think I should have, or anything we haven't discussed that you think would be relevant? And then I tell them, you know, we've all had the experience where we talk to someone, maybe it's a job interview, maybe it's just a conversation with a friend, and half an hour later, you think, I should have mentioned this. I forgot that. That may happen to you 10 minutes after you leave the office. When you get home tomorrow or next week, please call me, no matter how minor it is. It's only human. I want to know those things. So please contact me. Make it very clear to them the door is open. Let them know, you know, I may need to contact you again. Is that going to be okay? And ensure you have means to do that. If someone is unhoused, you want to ask, who do you maintain regular contact with? Who could get a message to you? If I need to reach you, you know, where would I be likely to find you if I need to find you? And one thing I failed to mention is it's very important in all the interviews, largely the information is going to flow one way. You can explain procedures, you can explain in general terms, the trajectory of the investigation. An investigator should not be providing anyone information about what anyone else has said, about anyone's reputation, about an officer's complaint history, about an individual's criminal history. I know this is a criticism of police. Often when there's a fatal officer involved shooting, information is provided to the press about the individual's criminal history. And you know, that can bias someone. So you are not to, and when I say you, I'm meaning the investigator, is not to give that information out. You want to get what someone knows without any filtering and without any influence. So then I'll talk about how the investigation proceeds in an agency. So typically the investigator will evaluate the evidence, will analyze the evidence, should do credibility assessments. Not all internal affairs agencies or oversight agencies do this. There are well-established factors in state and federal law for the factors that jurors should consider in evaluating credibility, and those should be applied by the investigator. They will then write a report analyzing the evidence with a recommended finding, and typically there should be at least one level of review in the agency. Now I know the documents I've seen talk about an executive director and investigators, and looking at the scope of responsibilities that this agency is going to have. I see the executive director having a lot of demands on their time, dealing with members of the community, dealing with the police department, dealing with issues of policy. I don't think they should be the only one to be supervising investigators and reviewing them. So there needs to be something built in there for a supervisory investigator. And this would be the first line of individual who's going to review the work and review it on a continuing basis. Make sure it's on track. See that investigation plan. Make sure all the issues are identified, that the proper allegations have been identified, that the appropriate sources of information have been touched on. If there are issues of training, talking to subject matter experts, finding out what training officers receive. In other words, what standard are they held to? So it's kind of the first line quality control. And then after it's gone through a supervisorial review, and the agency I worked, we had in-house attorneys who would review it, do edits, make sure they felt the findings were sound. And it would go to the executive director generally when it was complete, ready for signature. Now, there was one executive director who took a more active role. She was an attorney with wide-ranging experience and very sharp legal mind. So she would take a more active role in the legal analysis, but someone does need to do that, because at some point, if the charges are substantiated, there's going to be some type of hearing, disciplinary hearing, and someone is going to need to know what are going to be the standards and how can this be presented, and do we have sufficient evidence to support those findings. Beyond the complaint against the individual officer, it's going to be also very important to look at patterns of behavior. And this is going to identify systemic issues. It may involve issues relating to necessary changes in policy. And I'm very proud of the policy specialist we had at the Department of Police Accountability, Samar Marion, who retired recently and who is just brilliant. Was a dynamo in bringing together communities around crafting new policies, getting them through, ensuring that officers were properly trained on them. It's just a wonderful model of this will have a much longer lasting effect than an investigation in an individual case. Identifying problems with supervision and with a culture of an agency. All officers go through field training after they graduate from the academy. And one field training officer can, with a bad attitude, with a bad approach, can infect everyone they train with a wrong view of how policing should be conducted, of what their authority is and how they should treat people. And identifying those areas is really important. The culture of a particular precinct or command can be influenced by the supervisors there, by the first line supervisors, by the sergeants. Identifying those trends is going to be really important for this commission, because ultimately you want to be preventative. If you're succeeding, you're preventing serious misconduct. When you read about things like George Floyd, I have to think, what was this officer's record? And were there warning signs? And could there have been intervention earlier on? Might have identified this officer as having problems, and maybe they should not have been in that department. Maybe, and I'm not going to speculate whether it's training or policy or officer's personality or the culture. But if you can identify those problems and address them early on, you can avoid those tragic consequences that we've all seen. So I think that's kind of taking you through the process, generally maybe in some more detail than you wanted in some elements. But would now be a good time for questions, Patrick?
Jason, it's so helpful. And I think the detail that you've given us just helps to clarify what this process even is for so many people. And I'm sure
one other
everyone,
area
oh,
I did want to mention is in terms of resources, is resources for training. And training needs to be ongoing. The field changes, technology changes, the law changes, police practices change. And training is really sort of a smorgasbord. Obviously, NACOL provides the most direct, relevant training for oversight. But otherwise, you really need to look at a lot of sources. The training that police officers receive at the academy can be invaluable. When I started at the Department of Police Accountability, was then the Office of Citizen Complaints in 1983, I attended as many of the academy classes as I could because I wanted to see how often what officers were being told to do, and also the culture of the training. And I also did a lot of ride-alongs. And every weekend for the first 9 or 10 weeks, I went out to a different precinct and did a ride-along. And I would get there and ask the watch commander if I could address the watch at the start, because they were all going to know I was there. They all know a civilian is riding along. And I'd say, look, I want to be candid. You may or may not like the fact that you have an oversight entity, that you're going to have civilians. But the reality is it's the law. This is what we're going to deal with. So I'm here because I want to learn as much as I can about your work and about the demands you face, the challenges you face, within parameters of safety. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here really to learn. And that went a long way to earning credibility. It made them say that these people are interested. They want to know this. And obviously that's a recommendation for commissioners as well. Making that personal connection, seeing how things work. In the same vein, you would want to do the equivalent of a ride along with community members. Walk through a community and say, learn about its demographics and its history, about its history of issues with law enforcement, about what are the resources in that community, the schools, the parks, healthcare, seniors. So when you're investigating a complaint, you have a sense of what's going on there because communities are diverse. We tend to live in one community and our travels may be fairly narrow and you can always learn more about it. There can be good training through Peace Officer Standards and Training. They have training on internal affairs investigation, officer involved shooting, homicide investigation. Another useful source is for defense investigators. As I mentioned, I did defense investigation for a long time. The California Defense Investigator Association has an outstanding 8 college credit program, Defense Investigator Training Academy, that goes through law, investigative processes, forensics. So I went through all of that. So that's another source. So you want to make sure you have the funding there for the investigators to receive training, and also some of the commissioners as well. So that's an important element for resources that I wanted to mention.
That's great. We're going to turn to questions in just a moment. I want to ask you, I didn't prepare you for this question, but I'm going to ask you a question that I think is on a lot of our minds. So we're at this point where we're being asked to chime in on the creation of an investigatory model for the new commission. And with your decades of experience, if you found yourself at this moment, can you give this community 3 or 4 things that you would say we must insist are a part of the CPP's investigatory model? Are there 3 or 4 things you can think of?
Yeah. Number 1 is resources, which means staffing. Now I know the ordinance allows some leeway as to which complaints the agency will investigate. And they gave a figure, I think, average 186 a year, But that may increase because you have civilians that people can go to. So that workload can increase. You want to have sufficient staffing so the agency does not become overwhelmed. And then the investigations take longer than they should have. Evidence is not gathered in a timely manner. And then the police union says, see, they're not doing it right. They're missing the deadlines. And in California, there's a statutory deadline of 12 months to take disciplinary action against an officer. In practical terms, it means the investigation needs to be completed between 6 and 9 months at the outlier. So you want to ensure you have enough staffing, and Patrick and I have talked, there's some models. I believe that the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland has written into its establishing ordinance ratio of 1 investigator for every 100 sworn officers. I think you could also use a ratio of calls for service or arrests, because that's going to give you a sense of activity. And I asked Patrick earlier today, how many sworn officers does San Diego Police Department have? And he didn't know. I couldn't find it on the website. That's something that should be public knowledge. So resources, which is in large part staffing, but that also means funding for necessary supplies, for experts you may need. We at my agency, we typically have almost all of our interviews transcribed. And I forgot to mention, interviews should be audio recorded. All interviews with police officers must be audio recorded by law. At the Oakland Community Police Review Agency, we both audio and video record all officer interviews. And my preference is to audio record all interviews with civilians, because that way you have an unambiguous record of what someone said. And if you go to a disciplinary hearing, that can be very important evidence. Transcription costs something. We use a service called rev.com. It's $1.25 per minute. So if you do a 2-hour interview, you can do the math. It can add up. If the investigators have to listen to that audio to summarize it, it's very time consuming and not an effective use of their time. So you want to be sure they have sufficient resources. Next would be authority. And you have built-in ability to subpoena, but beyond that, there needs to be a enforced protocol for obtaining evidence and documents from the police department in a timely manner. And in San Francisco, again, Samar Marion crafted a document protocol with the department, which set timeframes for production of a whole list of documents, and most were classified as routine, had to be produced within 48 hours. And the agency made regular reports to the police commission on how well the police department was complying with those. Because without the ability to enforce a rule, it really doesn't have much meaning. It's easy to stymie the efforts of an oversight agency by simply not producing things in a timely manner. And some things are really critical to obtain quickly. So we had immediate access to computer-assisted dispatch records. We had a computer terminal where we could run those. That was very helpful. A complainant could come in and they would often fill out a complaint form. And before you did the interview, based on the information they put down, the date, time, location, you could determine which officers were involved. You'd have a printout of what happened with that incident. You could identify the police report and get some of the outline of that and make the request for it, or including the narrative. So you knew who some of the players were. You knew how many officers were there, who they were, maybe whether there were witnesses, evidence that was booked, and enabled you to do a more thorough interview. So having those resources is really going to be important. And last one is leadership. You want to ensure that you have the right executive director. I think the easiest way to undermine oversight is say, well, we'll have oversight, we'll give you money and whatever you need. And then you put in an executive director who's not going to be courageous, who's going to have their own self-interest above that of the agency and its mission, who is going to bend when they shouldn't, who is not going to provide the effective leadership. Unfortunately, this is a situation that we encountered in San Francisco over time. So I would recommend, if the agency has a staff, as part of the director's annual performance evaluation, you do an anonymous climate survey of the staff. And you can find these online. There's one that we did. I could send you the questions. It was based on an audit done by the San Francisco Controller's Office, where they came in and did a performance audit and did an anonymous survey of their employees. And I had worked for them briefly doing whistleblower complaint investigations. And they did that of their own staff every year, and they published the details. So there was transparency there. And that's an important way to identify areas for improvement, areas where the agency is not performing as it should in terms of providing training. We had issues in terms of lack of up-to-date technology. So it's important. It's essentially a report card on the agency's leader. And they're key. With the right leadership and guidance, an agency can make tremendous headway, and the people who work there can feel good about their work. And one thing I want to mention, this goes to staffing. This work is very difficult and unrewarding and challenging in many ways. I did defense investigation, and you had a whole community of people involved in criminal defense who supported what you do. There are organizations, public defender offices across the state and the nation. And conversely, people in law enforcement, whether they work for a police department, a sheriff's department, a district attorney's office, they have a very strong community. And oversight, civilian oversight, we're kind of in the middle. NACOL is a very important resource and community, but you really can't be aligned with either the police department or the community. And often your findings are going to displease one or both. So you have to have people who are really highly motivated to do this. They have to be committed. They have to care about it. But you need a leader who is going to reinforce that and give them, establish a standard and a spirit that people can follow.
That's great. So we're going to transition to questions and discussion now. If you could send me the questions that you mentioned for the anonymous climate survey. I know a couple people in the chat would like to see it, so I can send it out. I can also think of 10, 20 groups that I work within that I think should be doing this stat. So thank you for that. And I'm going to ask one question that's coming up, and I'll send that to everybody here on the list. So one of the questions that's come up in the chat, for folks in the community, if you want to use the raise hand function, I'll use that to call on people in order. If you're on the phone, you click *6. Otherwise, you can click raise hand by clicking reactions at the bottom of your screen and click raise hand. So you several times in this really helpful narrative, you've talked about looking for structural issues, looking for patterns of behavior. And as you well know, California POBAR laws restrict some of what we should be able to see when it comes to patterns of behavior and so on. So in your experience, how have you found ways to work within those limitations in the interest of true accountability?
Well, at the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, we had access to our complaint history. And our agency was the agency where civilian complainants came. There was no option for them to go to the police department. We did not have access to internal affairs investigations, which might come from an internal complaint, from another officer, from a whole range of areas. So we could, and I did look at those to see if this was a pattern. And I remember learning, one case learning, unfortunately, after the fact, officers are required to provide their name and badge number when requested in San Francisco. And there was a complaint where someone said they asked the officer for their name and they said Frank Jordan. Frank Jordan was a former chief of police and mayor of San Francisco. We didn't have witnesses to that. After the fact, we discovered there were previous complaints where people had said they asked this officer that question and he said Frank Jordan. So what would be the likelihood of 2 or 3 complainants who don't know each other all saying that the same officer gave the same response? Now, again, there are some legal issues about using the past behavior. I think it can be relevant. The Oakland CPRA, when they substantiate allegations, and this is a recent change in their law and regulations as of January 1st, they also put together a disciplinary memo listing disciplinary actions over the previous 5 years, also containing information about the officer's performance appraisal. And they have a list of aggravating and mitigating factors. So aggravating would be, let's say, the conduct was intentional. Mitigating might be the officer was new and inexperienced and maybe not familiar with those regulations. So there can be some input there.
Okay. Thank you for that. Your emphasis on the commission itself tracking a history of complaints against officers is crucial here, I think. So I see 2 hands so far. Yasmin, you're first, followed by Dahlia. And Dahlia, I know you also have a question in the chat, so you'll get a chance in just a moment to ask that and more. So Yasmin, you're up.
Hey folks, thank you so much for taking the time to answer our questions. Jason, thank you so much for your knowledge and sharing it with us. My question is specifically about the plan for having interpretation translation services for families who English isn't their native language and might want to file a complaint or communicate with the investigator or the Board of Commission itself. What is the plan to accommodate for these families? And if there is one, what languages are provided? Because San Diego has a lot of languages within our families.
In San Francisco, we used Language Line, where we could call and tell them what language we needed, and they would get someone on the line and that person would interpret. We could also use that in the field. So if we were knocking on someone's door and you encountered someone who did not speak English, you could call them up. We could use a brochure that police officers carried, which would list, and I don't know how many dozen languages had, where you could show it to them and they could point to the language they wanted to communicate in. And then you could call up Language Line and identify that. So obviously if they come in person, you can do that. If they call, that would be a little more challenging. We had a large staff. We had at least 15 investigators. So we had 2 investigators who were bilingual, English and Spanish. We had an investigator who spoke Cantonese. At one point we had one who spoke Russian, one who spoke Tagalog. So we had people who spoke different languages on staff. So if someone called or came in where English was not their first language, and we had an investigator who spoke that language, we could have them take that complaint either immediately or let the complainant know we have someone who will call you back. But there may be other services other than Language Line. We had a lot of success with them. And they
yeah, that's really helpful. And Yasmin, your question makes me realize that we need to develop a plan, whether it's having a Language Line on call, having a card like Jason's describing that would then lead to someone who could communicate with that person. But the commission itself needs to have a plan, both for the intake of complaints and also for the investigators who are doing field interviews. Am I hearing that right, Yasmin?
Yes, that is wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm definitely looking forward to taking a look at that plan once it's developed. Thank you.
I'm sure that we'll be asking for help putting it together. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay.
Some oversight agencies will have specific positions reserved for someone who's bilingual, say in English, Spanish, in Chinese, where they, to address a community where they have a large number of people who speak that language. I know that's the case in Oakland, where there's at least one position specifically designed for someone who is bilingual.
Yeah, good. That's a good point. So it goes into the hiring documents, not
Yeah.
just a sort of post-contact plan. Yeah. Okay, Dahlia, you're up.
Yeah, hi, Patrick. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jason, for such a thorough review over a lot of the logistics on the investigations on the complaint. What really stands out for me, and I think about all this, is what is the vetting process as we're hiring investigators? In this case, this is so important, and being mindful, moving, not only looking at the day-to-day tasks, but who are the people that we're hiring? I'm thinking of, like, are we looking for, people who are understanding the profiling, understanding the research and data on profiling by the police? Are these folks change agents? Are they, equity, understanding what equitable behavior means, what, I call them equity warriors. How are they going to investigate from an equitable, inclusive, multicultural, multiracial, ethnic lens? This is very important because there's folks out there who know how to do the work, but they're not even in touch with or even aware of some of their own stereotypes and biases. So how are we going to vet through those individuals to understand that it's just more than a job? We're looking at investigators who can really understand what's happening. And so when they bring themselves to the investigation role, they have these things already existing, right? And so the idea for what I'm thinking about is that, how is the agency going to be more conscious in hiring to minimize the likelihood of folks who are perpetuating non-inclusive environments as they're doing their work?
That's a very good question. I've sent Patrick the job descriptions for investigator positions at different oversight agencies, and which I think is useful to use as a baseline, because you want to be inclusive in putting the net tossing that as far afield as you can to get people. So I was looking last night at the Portland as an oversight agency, and they list bios of their investigators. And I invite you to take a look at that. They come from a variety of backgrounds. I know one from a sort of civil rights investigation background, doing sort of workplace EEO type investigations. Several did criminal defense investigations, which is very similar in that you're dealing with many of the same issues, the same communities, you're dealing with the same police records. You have to have the same communication skills and sensitivity and cultural skills, because you're meeting with your clients, you're going into those communities, and you're knocking on doors. And some of it goes into the testing process and identifying the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you're going to use. So a good testing process should involve a written exercise where you give someone a scenario and ask them how you would respond. Some I participated in have a role playing, where someone comes in and they play the role of a complainant or a witness, and you have to show how you would conduct that interview. I went for an interview many years ago for a supervisory position, and they said, okay, you go to a community meeting and you expect to just be there to listen, but they say, can you please explain why your agency hasn't done this? Go. And you had to talk to them as though you were talking to that community. And that, is a way of gauging your communication skills, your sensitivities, your understanding of that community. So I said, there's a lot that can be learned. Police officers learn these things or should learn these things in the academy. They should have courses on cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity. So oversight investigators can also learn those. You may
That's, you know, that's one of the things that's helpful that you've said numerous times is that I don't think we've thought a lot about as part of this process is that investigators themselves should be receiving ongoing training. That should be structured, predictable, and so on. And I think that training should also be community-based in addition to being training in officer education, changing laws, and so on. So this is actually an opportunity for the commission to involve those community members who've been showing up for years to do this kind of work and to support this kind of work, to actually involve themselves in the training that I think Dahlia is asking about in part, you know. In other words, not to assume that the commission has the answers to all these questions, but rather to turn to the community that supports the commission to do that training. Dahlia, does that speak to part of your concern? And Jason, does that also speak to the ongoing training?
Yeah, because it definitely does. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about this type of work, we have to remember whose voice are we centering, right? And so that's really important. And so those around who are doing the work, who have these, you know, should have these critical thinking skills in addition to the, you know, certain personality traits or whatever, but there's more to it than just being warm and inviting. That's part of it, but there's also the element of inclusivity, which is very strategic, very critical thinking, very much about centering the individual as you're taking down the, you know, the information on the claims, right? All of that. So yes, Patrick.
Thank you for that. And we want to center the person in the room with you who's waving at us. We're so glad she's there. Darwin, I see you're next up with a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. This really good presentation. Sorry I came in late. I know I just went to a CLEAR meeting. I talked to Paul Parker, their executive director. They're hiring, I believe, 3 people, investigators. So that's one. And then second, it's true that they need training, but there's also a lot of really good folks out there that hopefully when we get to that part in terms of hiring that we'll look at that, that already have the background and experience that would go bode well for being an investigator for our new CPP.
Yeah, I didn't know CLEAR was in the middle of hiring right now. I'm sure we can pull their job ads and also pay some attention to their process to see what's going on.
Oh yeah, well then let me also then share real quickly. Part of that is because CLEAR had a year where they dropped over 20 cases. They didn't investigate within that year time frame, and because those were, and a good chunk of them were in custody deaths, part of their what they said is that they needed more staff. So it's really critical, following what's been shared with us, that we're very mindful of that. If you really want to hurt the oversight, you starve it of the staff that's needed, the professional staff. So that's a really critical piece.
Absolutely. Jason, go ahead, Jason.
I just wanted to mention, I sent Patrick a link and the PDF of the manual that's used by the Seattle Office of Police Accountability. And that's an internal affairs unit that's overseen by a civilian director. And that manual was originally written by Pierce Murphy, who was a former president of NACOL and just an outstanding practitioner in oversight, now retired. And it contains a section on the attributes a investigator should have. So I suggest you might want to take a look at that because it's very well thought out and very exhaustive and detailed.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to send out everything you sent me today to this entire group. So thank you for those.
One other thing regarding vetting, typically investigators need to undergo a criminal background check in order to have access to police records. I strongly suggest that San Diego Police Department not conduct that check. You have an independent agency. Obviously, they have a certain interest in this. And I know that's been the practice in other agencies. In Seattle, they used a different, totally different agency.
That seems like a critical point for us to insist on, that the commission itself be in charge of doing the background checks and deciding which agencies conduct those background checks, conduct the interviews, and so on. So other transition committee members, let's ensure, I'm taking notes, but let's ensure that that's on our list of things to talk about for the city attorney. I have a couple specific questions about investigatory models that I have, but before I do that, Dolly, I see you have a question too.
Yes, on the background check. So I'm just curious to know, or maybe something that will be covered next time or later on, so you do a background check, something shows up, like what are we looking for? Because as you know, certain people have a criminal background based on disparities in our criminal justice system. And so what are we looking at, and how, because that might actually exclude people who could actually do this work, right? So that's also something to be mindful of. How are we going to create an equitable lens, understanding that our criminal justice system disproportions certain groups, and which is why they have a criminal background. So there's that other piece.
Yeah, that's something you need to explore with the San Diego Police Department. It's really looking at the criteria for accessing their databases, their records of arrests, reports that might list someone as a witness or a victim. And they have a set criteria for police officers, but the civilian investigators do not have the powers and authority police officers have. So I think you want to clarify that and set those standards early on, and say, well, why is it necessary to have this background? If someone had a minor arrest as a teenager or when they're early 20s and they're now in their 40s, why should that bar them from accessing this information? Because I remember we had an investigator who I thought was very good, who had a very minor, I think it was possession of nunchucks when he was young, and that screened him out. And that didn't make much sense to me. And so I think that's something the commission is going to need to establish with them to ensure they can't just say, sorry, we're not going to give this person access because they were once arrested for X.
Yeah, this is important. One of the things this community insisted on over the course of the last 4 roundtables was removing a felony exclusion from membership on the CRB. And we were successfully able to get that removed from the interim bylaws and standard operating procedures. So I think between Darwin and Dahlia, we're being reminded that we need to make sure that exclusion isn't there for investigators too. I wonder if you could just, Jason, for a minute, you know, when we think about an independent commission doing investigations, one of the radical departures from what the CRB used to do as a review board is that investigations are no longer going to be after the fact. In other words, our review of the internal affairs cases in the CRB model happened when the IA investigation had already happened. It wasn't yet closed, but it had already happened. In your opinion, does an independent investigatory model require investigations to be concurrent, consecutive, and so on, or something else entirely, with homicide investigations and IA investigations? And are there challenges to a simultaneous model where the CPP investigators show up with internal affairs to interview and so on? Are there challenges that we could anticipate as we contribute to the drafting of an implementation ordinance?
Well, in the Oakland CPRA, they do parallel investigations and they do joint interviews of officers. And I have not had occasion to do that. I am told that has worked well, that they have a good relationship with internal affairs under their current commission. Whether that will continue, I don't know. Oakland, like a lot of cities, is facing budgetary challenges, and there may be discussion of not having internal affairs conduct a parallel investigation. But I think that's just speculation on my part. If internal affairs is, it can have advantages, because internal affairs is going to investigate a lot of things that CPP will not investigate. And having that exposure to CPP investigators may enhance their skills. Typically, internal affairs investigators are there for a set period of time, and then they rotate into a different assignment. But the CPP investigators will have longer experience doing these types of investigations, and may be able to teach them something, may be able to help them improve their style, and vice versa. Anytime I've done a joint interview with someone, I feel I come away learning something about how they do their work. So I think there can be advantages to that. Regarding shooting and death cases, the policy, and in San Francisco and Oakland, a lot of municipalities, the civilian oversight investigators roll out to the scene of the incident, roll out to the shooting scene. They're given a walkthrough by the homicide investigators who take charge, and the criminal investigation by the homicide detail, the district attorney's office, is going to take precedence, because if it's a criminal violation, then charges will be filed. The administrative investigation will be secondary to that. Officers cannot be compelled to give statements in a criminal investigation. They can in an administrative investigation, but then there must be a firewall between the administrative investigation and the criminal investigation. Their interview cannot be used in the criminal investigation, and information they provide cannot be used. So I think the current procedure in San Francisco, and I have some notes on this. Is that the Civilian Oversight Agency monitors the criminal interviews of the criminal units in interviews of civilian and officer witnesses. And I believe they may do that. I'm not sure whether they do that from inside the room or from another room by video. There's no explicit provision for them to suggest questions. I think perhaps they should. So yeah, that's something you're going to need to work out a protocol on. And I believe the oversight entity should respond to the scene. It's really valuable to just see what things look like, see what sight lines are, the physical layout, lighting conditions. There may be witnesses who will talk to a civilian investigator and not to someone from law enforcement. But typically the law enforcement, and by that I mean the homicide investigation, I don't know whether it's done there by the San Diego Police Department homicide detail or by the district attorney's office. In San Francisco, they usually do that jointly. Or rather, they did do it jointly. We now have a special unit in our district attorney's office that is specially tasked with investigating officer-involved shootings and serious uses of force. And they roll out an investigator and a team of investigators and an attorney. And I think that's something you're gonna have to work out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a complicated process. So one of the other questions that's sort of coming up in different ways in the chat is about other kinds of administrative investigations. As I'm sure you saw, Jason, the new CPP has expanded auditing oversight of other, Doug, what's the exact phrasing of this? Do you remember, of other internal investigations to SDPD officers? Some of what's coming up in the chat is about connection to white supremacist organizations, domestic violence complaints, DWIs, and so on. Doug, do you have that language?
Yes, we'll be able to review all police misconduct, whether it comes from a complaint or not, and misconduct is something that's being defined by ordinance, but we'll have the ability to we won't have the ability to investigate something unless it's a shooting, in custody, death, or a complaint, but we will have the ability to review investigations of all police misconduct, whether so. Currently, there's a lot of investigations, of internal investigations, that we never hear about because they don't, no, they're not resolved. They don't come about as a result of a complaint, and therefore we never hear about it, and the community never hear about it. The new CPP will have the authority to review all department investigations of police misconduct, including sexual assault, domestic violence, etc.
So I'm wondering, Jason, if you have any recommendations for those kinds of cases where the CPP has new powers to monitor and audit those other complaints, and we don't strictly have the ability to investigate them, but of course we're monitoring and auditing them.
That's a really important power to have. And there are a lot of oversight entities that have that auditing power. It's very valuable. Allows you to see what is being investigated, how it is being investigated, to hopefully, if necessary, influence that investigation to make sure it is thorough and impartial and done properly. And to be able to discern patterns, because you're seeing a whole range of other activities of law enforcement that may not be coming in through complaints. So there are many very experienced auditors in civilian oversight around the country who you can tap into and who have far more. I don't have really direct experience with that, but I can give Patrick names of people who are very experienced and can give you a lot of suggestions about that. But
that last point especially, that makes me think that the commission should consider having a staff auditor who's trained in reviewing those kinds of misconduct cases, in addition, as a part of the investigatory team.
Yes.
So as to take full advantage of that new power afforded by Measure B.
Yes. I'm sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
The field of auditing goes beyond police oversight. There are professional organizations of auditors. There's essentially a book of standards, 2 books of standards, the Yellow Book and the Blue Book. I think I have one of them here. So yes, and there's an accreditation program. So yes, you should have an auditor on staff. And again, that's going to be a somewhat specialized skill, but there are a lot of people in oversight who have done that work and can give you advice on how to define the knowledge, skills, and abilities for that position, how to structure the job description and what to look for. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, one great advantage you have is that San Diego is a very desirable place to live. You get people who live elsewhere in the country who may be willing to relocate there. You have a very nice climate. I know at least, I know 2 people who have said they plan to retire to San Diego. So you can draw talent there.
That's great. I'm looking forward to getting that list of people have specific expertise in this, and I'm sure we'll reach out to them. Another question about investigations of use of force and the police shootings of unarmed people that's come up in the chat. And the question is, how will AB 1506 affect the commission's ability to investigate complaints arising from police shootings of unarmed people? And I'll put the URL to 1506 in the chat for people who want to familiarize themselves with it. but it's the official title, I think, is the Police Use of Force Bill, and it was signed in September by the governor.
And that changes the standard for use of deadly force. Am I correct?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Has the San Diego Police Department changed its policy to be consistent with that?
I remember there being a discussion about this. Doug or Brandon or anyone else on the interim commission, do you have an answer to that question?
I don't, they changed their standards to, comply with the new standard of force from maybe 1392, Trudy Weber's bill. But I'm not familiar with AB 1506, and so I'm not sure.
Because for an administrative investigation, you can hold an officer responsible for the policies of their agency that they have been trained on or are expected to know. And there's extensive training on use of force, there's force simulation scenarios, and I recommend all the commissioners go through that, where they show you different scenarios and you're equipped with a replica gun that fires a light beam, tracks where it's aimed, baton, mock OC spray, and reenact scenarios, real life scenarios. And it's not so much designed to show can an officer hit a target, but for them to be able to explain and justify their actions in light of their training and the policy.
And
it's a way of ensuring that they are familiar with that policy and will be able to follow it in a pressured situation.
Oh, wow, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I won't take up the group's time. Okay, I'm not seeing any immediate questions coming up. Are there other comments or questions that the group would like to pose for Jason, or ideas that you have for me to take back to the transition committee? Doug.
Sorry. Yeah, can you address the different procedures that various oversight agencies have to compel an officer to attend either an interview or an investigatory hearing?
Mm-hmm. That needs to be written into the police department policies to state that officers shall attend and shall cooperate. And the San Francisco Police Department general orders, which are online, contain language to effect that essentially when the CPP sends an officer a notice, it has the same effect as a legal subpoena, that the oversight entity is speaking with the voice of the chief of police, and that disobeying that would be equivalent to disobeying a direct order from the chief. And in San Francisco, we did find officers guilty of violating that if they failed to show up for a scheduled interview, if they came to an interview and refused to answer questions. In fact, we had a whole script we would read at the outset of the interview explaining their rights and obligations and saying that they are obligated to answer questions truthfully, that their representative cannot interfere, that failure to answer questions truthfully could result in discipline.
Okay. Can I assume, therefore, that any response they gave to a compelled interview could not be used against them in a legal proceeding?
In a criminal proceeding, yes. And I think they also had language in there related to that. And sometimes their representatives would bring that up to put it on the record, because it is a compelled interview. And so they do not have a right against self-incrimination and therefore can't be used in a criminal case. Did you mention civil case or criminal?
No, I meant criminal. So
okay.
And I don't know about civil. Maybe you can enlighten me whether it can be used in a civil case or not.
I know that in San Francisco, when I was there, and I was last time 4 years ago, the city attorney's office would request our investigations where they were concluded. And I believe that the plaintiffs could obtain some of that information through discovery.
And then another separate question, are you aware of any models where the volunteer commissioners are involved in hearings, conducting hearings?
Yes. That's done in San Francisco. It's done in Oakland. I have more familiarity with San Francisco, but in San Francisco, the chief of police can suspend an officer for up to 10 days. Any discipline beyond that has to come from the police commission. So they will have a hearing in closed session because that is considered confidential unless the officer waives confidentiality.
Yeah.
And
How
I
about
believe
having
there are many others as well.
and so what about hearings to make a ruling on the findings of whether an officer violated policy or not?
Well, that would be that hearing. They would
Okay.
determine whether they agreed with the findings, and there are others as well. And there may be some information on the NACOL website about which agencies, which commissions or boards have that authority.
And can you recommend any policies we may want to take a look? These policies maybe we may want to take a look at as we develop our own.
San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley are the ones I'm most familiar with. I believe also Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And one thing I wanted to mention that I noticed in the text of the measure, and that's where it talks about the commission receiving, reviewing, and evaluating all complaints, except must not review or evaluate a complaint. And it contains the language where no specific allegation or police officer can be identified. And I flag the idea of can be identified, and at what stage in the process must the officer be identified? And I could see a scenario, many complaints come in and they do not have the officer's name. They can provide a description, a time, place, location, particularly if they're a witness. Could the police union come in and say, well, that officer has not been identified, therefore the CPP cannot review or evaluate it? So, all officers are identified at various stages of the process. Someone may have video footage, they may have their name, they may have asked for the officer's name, but there may be different investigative steps that have to be taken to identify that officer. And could that be a roadblock? So I just saw that. And
so for example, if someone files a complaint, they don't know the officer, and then later on down the road, the commission is able to identify which officer it is, the union could come in and say, well, the complaint didn't identify the officer, and so this complaint cannot be investigated. That's your worry here.
yes. Or does it mean after investigation, they cannot be identified?
Yeah, okay, I've got that. I remember that from our conversation. I've got that in my notes too. Well, this is, I know we've gotten a lot of information from Jason. My head is swimming. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, I feel like I learned 100 things or however many things I didn't even know I didn't know, and that continues to be true. Jason, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And also, I know that you spent time studying the commission and Measure B and where things are. So I want to thank you for that prep for this meeting too. This has been incredibly valuable. I want to say to the community that I've got a new email address. We all got city email addresses, and so we're trying to move over communications to these other addresses. So if you haven't been on our list for outreach and for events like this, please feel free to send me an email. I just put the new email address in the chat. And I would be happy to add you to the list. I'm not seeing a lot more questions, and no one's got a hand raised, so I'm starting to think that maybe we're drawing to a close here. But if there's anyone out there who wants to ask a question or put something on the table. Now there are some comments and questions about this identifying an officer exclusion. And there's a question about in cases where an officer is not initially identified, will the commission have access to GPS and cell phone tracking information? That's a great question.
I would think if it's a department issued cell phone, there should be no expectation of privacy, just as if you work for an employer and are using their computer, you have no expectation of privacy. So yes, I think anything related to a department issued equipment should potentially be accessible. I don't know the technology very well of how they would be able to do that. But I think it would be possible. And there are a lot of other means of identifying officers. I don't know if your cars
tracking them, and
have GPS devices.
Yeah. So that's, I think all of that data and technology the CPP should have access to. Andrea, you've got a question.
I do. And at first I do have a comment. I want to make it very clear, the line that we're talking about not being able to identify an officer, I did not write that line. So
That doesn't surprise me.
Because
it doesn't surprise me.
Yes, as soon as I saw that someone else had added that to my charter amendment, I thought that could have been written a whole lot better than it was. But I want to make clear, and I want to amplify something that Jason said. You don't, in the first instance, you have to talk about more than how to identify an officer. In the first instance, you have to talk about when the identification takes place and who has responsibility for it and who has to help with that. So for example, you first have to say that the officer does not have to be identified in the complaint itself. Okay, that has to be made very clear. The second thing you're going to have to make very clear is that it is the commission that will determine whether or not a police officer can be identified, not the police department, okay? And then the third thing is, while the commission will have the laboring or of identifying the police officer, but the police department is going to have the complete responsibility and duty to assist you in identifying the officer. So you have to make sure all of those things are in place to make that line as clear as it should have been in the first place.
I didn't think you wrote that, Andrea.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Jason, just so you know, Andrea St. Julian, longtime community organizer, attorney, and the author of Measure B, which led to the creation of the commission, just so you know.
Well, thank you for your work on that, Andrea. That's a wonderful product.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
There would be a lot of scenarios where an unidentified officer's behavior would be very relevant. The first that comes to mind is something I think you discussed in one of your previous roundtables, is social media postings. And that's come up recently since January 6th. An officer could post anonymously, and that's something that's been reported in the press as being investigated in Oakland, where an officer posted comments indicating sophisticated knowledge of Oakland Police Department procedures and practices, making people believe it was a member of that department. So even if you can't identify that officer or officers, it's important for the oversight entity to know that that is out there. And that may be an issue. It might relate to culture. It might be very isolated, and it might not. And in San Francisco, every time I interviewed an officer with an allegation of biased policing, their representative would say, our department is very diverse. We get very good training, and therefore that type of bias, overt discrimination or hostility would not exist, would not be tolerated. And then we had a case of very horribly racist text messages being sent by a group of officers, which sort of shattered that that belief that some people may have had. And even in a very diverse city like San Francisco, where I would wonder, why would someone who would have that sense of hate for members of another group, want to work in a city that's so diverse when they could go work in a much more homogeneous community where they might feel more at home. But it existed, and thankfully was brought to light. But that was really just a fluke. That it was.
Ariana, I see you have a question.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. Yeah, I joined in a little bit late, but I do have a question. I don't know if this is something that could be answered here, but I guess what are your thoughts about, you know, the police department putting out statements after an incident of police misconduct or police brutality when there hasn't been an independent case started or independent investigation? And I'm asking because there was a recent incident here in San Diego on Tuesday where there was a child, and from many people it does look like the police officer was pointing a gun at an 8-year-old child, and the police did come out with a statement that that was not the case. But I think it's just so it's very disheartening to even have someone experience that. But I guess my question is, like, in what ways could the commission stop, like, the police department from putting out statements like that when there hasn't even been an investigation started?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that. I can see issues with the police department offering a judgment about something before it's been investigated if there isn't definitive evidence. But I can also see the importance of making sure relevant facts are known, particularly if there is a video or more than one video and they have body-worn camera footage that may show something different. And a lot of research showing that you know, a video camera shows a very limited perspective of what happened. And there need to be other sources of information. So I think police agencies are moving towards greater transparency, making body-worn camera footage available sooner rather than later. I think certainly giving out information about an individual's criminal history is maybe inappropriate. You know, because the press is asking questions doesn't mean they all have to be answered. I think you can say there's an investigation. We expect it to be concluded within such and such a time frame, and until then, we don't want to offer opinions. And but I think there are people far more qualified in police management in this area to answer that.
Yeah, it's a good question, Ariana, and I think the best we can do on the commission side is to ensure that our investigators are not being prejudiced by early communications about those kinds of events, and maintaining some way of checking in with the investigators we hire over time to make sure that those early communications aren't working when it comes to prejudicing the investigators. I think we seem to be drawing to a close. We're a few minutes early, but I think, let me say to Jason, you are a superstar. It is so generous. You have so much knowledge. I feel smarter now than I did 2 hours ago. And I also feel like I have a lot of homework to go learn about so much of what you've told us we must know before we proceed. Whatever you have sent to me, and I know you're going to send me a couple other things, I will share them with widely with the community. Just so that folks here know, the CPP website is being revised and updated, and they're going to start doing a lot of the tracking that I've been doing on my UCSD site. But I'm going to continue for the time being to post stuff until the commission site is updated. And so feel free to check the site that I just put in the chat. Over the next couple days, I'll update it with this video and with all the materials that Jason sends me. So Jason, thank you so much. And to the folks who showed up tonight, thank you so much. Feel free to reach out to me, to other members of the Interim Commission, to Charmaine. If anything occurs to you, as Jason said, 10 minutes from now, we're all going to have 3 brilliant ideas about how the CPP should proceed. So please feel free to reach out to us, and I'll make sure that everything expressed to me is passed on. If everyone wants to go down to their reactions button and click the little hands there so that we can applaud Jason without being in the same room. Jason, once more, thank you so much. This is incredibly, incredibly helpful.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I applaud you for all your effort and time and energy you've put into this. I know you've had other roundtables, and I know how time consuming it is to establish an oversight agency. And speaking as someone who's been involved in oversight a long time, I really appreciate what you're doing to get it right and being so deliberate and thoughtful. So
that goes to all of us here, because everyone on your screen has been showing up from the very beginning to participate in this process. So, all right, everybody, have a good night. I hope you're all safe and healthy, and I hope you stay that way. And Jason, again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you.
Thank you. Be well, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, y'all.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.